Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The dim lights of cell 314 flickered overhead, casting long, restless shadows on the metallic walls. Arden Voss, slumped against the cold corner, absently traced the scars on his arm, the marks of a life that no longer belonged to him. The silence of the prison was its own form of torture, a reminder that time here didn't just pass, it weighed down, suffocating the soul. There was no escape from it. Not the walls, not the guards, and not even in sleep. His dreams had always been his sanctuary. Even when he'd been out there, running jobs across the system, dodging bounty hunters and Federation enforcers, sleep was a safe haven. It was the one place no one could touch him, where the ghosts of his past couldn't reach. Until now. The nightmares had started a week ago. At first, they were just unsettling. Flashes of memories distorted people he'd known, faces twisted, voices garbled like broken transmissions. But then they grew worse, sharper, more real. His body ached when he woke, and the exhaustion gnawed at him like a sickness. Something was wrong, and he knew it wasn't just in his head. It wasn't until last night, when he found himself running endlessly down a corridor that looped in on itself, that he realized he wasn't alone in the dream. There was something with him. He couldn't see it, not clearly, but he could feel it, watching, waiting, and hunting. Arden sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. The thin fabric of his prison uniform clung to his skin, damp and cold. His breath hitched as his gaze darted toward the cell door. He wasn't sure why. The guards rarely came this deep into the solitary wing, and the other inmates had long since stopped making noise. But something felt off. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, the room seemed to stretch, elongate in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Arden blinked hard, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of the nightmare. Then, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, he thought it was coming from the ventilation shaft above him, just another mechanical malfunction in this rusting heap of a prison. But the sound was too deliberate, too personal. It echoed in his mind, not his ears. It wasn't a sound, it was a presence. Who's there? Arden's voice cracked, more out of fear than curiosity. The whisper didn't answer, but it lingered, circling him like a predator studying its prey. He could feel its intent, probing the edges of his consciousness, slipping in through cracks he didn't even know were there. His vision blurred for a moment, the walls around him warping as though they were made of liquid, bending and twisting. He shut his eyes tight, but the images persisted. His hands gripped the edge of his cot as his heartbeat quickened. His mind was no longer his own. Something else had taken hold. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sensation vanished. The room snapped back to its grim, metallic reality. But Arden was left with a hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach, like a piece of him had been torn away. For the rest of the night, sleep didn't come. The next day, Arden paced the length of his cell, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't answer. No one else seemed to be affected. When the guards came to bring his meal, their expressions were as vacant as always, mechanical in their routines. The other prisoners were silent, resigned to their fates. But Arden could feel it, simmering beneath the surface, something dark, something hungry. It was watching him. And then, it happened again. This time, it wasn't subtle. As soon as he closed his eyes, he was pulled into the nightmare world, the lines between dream and reality blurring almost instantly. Arden stood on a vast, barren plain, the sky above him a swirl of dark clouds, churning like an angry sea. In the distance, he could see figures, distorted, shadowed shapes moving toward him, their forms shifting and merging like a mirage. He tried to move, but his feet felt glued to the ground. Panic surged through him, but no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. The whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They weren't words exactly, but more like thoughts, alien, incomprehensible, but insistent. They pressed against his mind, invading his thoughts, twisting them, until he could barely remember who he was or why he was here. And then, He saw it, the Reaper. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting between shapes, one moment humanoid, the next a mass of writhing tendrils. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was featureless, a blank void that seemed to suck in all the light around it. But its eyes were everywhere, watching him, piercing through his soul, feeding on his fear. The Reaper moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Arden could feel his mind slipping, the last vestiges of his sanity crumbling under the weight of the creature's influence. He tried to fight, to push it away, but it was too strong. The Reaper reached out, and as its hand passed for a hand that touched his chest, Arden felt a searing pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, something that tore at the very essence of his being. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning out of control. And then, everything went black. When Arden woke, he was back in his cell, drenched in sweat, his body trembling uncontrollably. The pain lingered, a dull throb in the back of his mind. But more than that, he felt empty, like something had been taken from him, something vital. He struggled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. His thoughts were a jumble, fragmented memories of the dream, or was it a dream? Flashing through his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that what he had experienced was real, that the Reaper wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was here, in the prison, and it wasn't going to stop until it had devoured him completely. Over the next few days, Arden became obsessed with finding answers. He spent hours scouring the prison's limited database, searching for any mention of the Soul Reapers. But there was nothing. No records, no reports, nothing that could explain what he was experiencing. It was as if the creature didn't exist. But Arden knew better. He could feel it, lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. It was during one of his restless searches that he stumbled upon Lyra, a fellow prisoner housed just a few cells down from his. She was a scientist, or at least she had been, before she'd been sent to this forsaken place. Like Arden, she had been having the same nightmares, the same encounters with the Reaper. At first, she was reluctant to talk, her eyes hollowed by weeks and maybe months of torment. But when she realized Arden was serious, that he had seen the Reaper too, she opened up. "It feeds on us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It traps us in our own minds, forces us to relive our worst memories, our greatest fears. And the more we suffer, the stronger it becomes." Arden nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone else made it all the more real. "But why?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "What does it want?" Lyra's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out, but..." She trailed off, her eyes glazing over as if she was lost in her own thoughts. Arden reached out, placing a hand on her arm. "Hey, we'll figure it out together." For the first time since he had met her, Lyra smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope so." Over the next few days, they worked together, piecing together the fragments of their dreams, trying to find a way to fight back against the Reaper. They experimented with lucid dreaming techniques, attempting to take control of their nightmares, to turn the tables on the creature that had been hunting them. It wasn't easy. Every time they tried to resist, the Reaper would retaliate, its attacks becoming more intense, more painful. But slowly, they began to make progress. They learned to manipulate the dream world, bending it to their will, creating weapons and defenses that they could use against the Reaper. But the Reaper wasn't going to go down without a fight. As their battles with the Reaper became more frequent, Arden could feel the toll it was taking on his body and mind. His movements became sluggish, and the lines between the waking world and the nightmare realm blurred with every passing day. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but giving up wasn't an option. Not now. Lyra had grown stronger, too. Where once she had been hollowed out by fear, She now moved with a purpose, her sharp mind calculating every advantage they could take within the dream world. Together, they had devised traps and strategies, exploiting the Reaper's overconfidence in its ability to manipulate them. Arden could see it now. The creature was powerful, yes, but it had become so reliant on its prey's fear that it had grown predictable. The next time it appeared, they were ready. The nightmare world sprang into existence as Arden closed his eyes, the familiar twisted landscape of barren plains stretching out before him. He felt the usual disorientation as space distorted around him, but this time, he forced himself to stay focused. He knew it was coming. The Reaper emerged from the mist, its shifting, amorphous form gliding toward them, those piercing, all-seeing eyes gleaming in the darkness. Arden could feel its hunger, its anticipation of their terror. It was confident, as always, that they would break. But not this time. Lyra appeared beside him, her expression cold and resolute. She raised her hand, and the ground beneath them rippled in response, bending to her will. They had practiced these at turning the nightmare into their weapon. As the Reaper advanced, the terrain shifted beneath it, slowing its movements, destabilizing the illusion of its control. Arden gripped the hilt of a sword he had manifested, its gleaming blade humming with power. It wasn't real, of course, but in the dream world, it might as well have been. He moved forward, feeling the weight of the weapon in his hand, his heartbeat steady as he closed the distance between himself and the creature. The Reaper hesitated. It wasn't used to resistance, wasn't accustomed to its prey fighting back. For a moment, it seemed almost confused. But then, it lashed out, a tendril of darkness shooting toward Arden with blinding speed. He was ready. Arden sidestepped the attack, the blade in his hand slicing through the tendril as if it were nothing but mist. The Reaper recoiled, and Arden pressed the advantage, driving it back with a flurry of strikes. Each swing of his sword felt more real than the last, as though he were shaping the dream world around him, making it his own. Beside him, Lyra manipulated the landscape, creating walls of shifting sand and stone to corral the Reaper, trapping it within the confines of their shared nightmare. The creature twisted and writhed, its form flickering as it struggled to maintain control. For the first time, Arden saw fear in its eyes. The Reaper lashed out again, more desperately this time, but its attacks were wild, unfocused. Arden ducked beneath a sweeping tendril, his sword flashing as he struck at the heart of the creature. The Reaper howled, a sound that reverberated through the entire nightmare world, shaking the ground beneath them. And then, it changed. The Reaper's form shifted violently, its body warping and expanding, growing into something far larger, far more grotesque than before. Its eyes multiplied, swirling around its massive frame, and its tendrils stretched out like a sea of darkness, reaching toward them from every direction. Arden felt a surge of panic rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and steady. "Stay with me, Arden. Don't let it take control." He nodded, tightening his grip on the sword as the Reaper lunged toward them. They had to end this now. With a final push of his will, Arden drove forward, his blade cutting through the creature's defenses, slashing through the dark tendrils that reached for him. The Reaper's howl grew louder, more frantic, and Arden could feel its control slipping. The nightmare world trembled around them, the ground beneath their feet cracking and splintering as the Reaper's power faltered. Lyra raised her hands, channeling her will into the dream, and the ground beneath the Reaper's massive form split open, creating a chasm that swallowed the creature whole. It screamed as it fell, its eyes flickering out one by one as its body was consumed by the darkness. And then, silence. The nightmare world dissolved around them, fading into nothingness, and Arden found himself back in his cell, the cold metal floor pressing against his skin. His body ached, his mind felt raw, but he was alive. More importantly, he was free. Lyra sat across from him, breathing heavily, her face pale but victorious. "We did it," she whispered, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "It's gone." Arden nodded, though part of him still couldn't believe it. After all the torment, all the nightmares, it was finally over. The Reaper was gone, but even as the relief washed over him, there was a lingering sense of unease. He had learned something during the final battle, something the Reaper had inadvertently revealed in its last moments. It wasn't the only one. As the days passed, Arden and Lyra adjusted to life without the constant threat of the Reaper hanging over them. The other prisoners, oblivious to the danger they had been in, continued their routines, unaware of the creature that had been feeding on their minds. But Arden couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had seen the Reaper's world, glimpsed its origins in those fragmented visions. There were more of them, scattered across the galaxy, hunting, feeding. And now that he had defeated one, he knew they would come for him. Arden wasn't a hero. He had never pretended to be. But something had changed in him during his time in the nightmare world. He had faced his worst fears, confronted the darkest parts of himself, and come out the other side stronger for it. He couldn't go back to being the man he was before. As he sat in his cell, staring out through the narrow window at the dying star beyond, he made a decision. He wouldn't wait for the next Reaper to find him, he would go to them. Lyra had her own path to follow. She had been through just as much as he had, maybe more, and she deserved a chance to live her life without the shadow of these creatures looming over her. But Arden wasn't done yet. He stood, stretching his tired muscles, and took one last look at the cell that had been his prison for so long. The door slid open with a hiss, and he stepped out into the corridor, the cold air biting at his skin. The prison was vast, sprawling across the surface of a barren moon, but Arden knew its layout like the back of his hand. He had spent years studying every detail, every exit, every potential escape route. And now, he was finally putting that knowledge to use. As he made his way toward the main control room, his mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the possibilities. The galaxy was vast, filled with more dangers than he could count, but Arden was ready. The Soul Reapers had shown him the worst they had to offer, and he had survived. Now, it was his turn to hunt them. He reached the control room, bypassing the security systems with ease. The guards had grown complacent over the years, and Arden had always been good at finding the cracks in any system. Within minutes, he had accessed the prison's communication array, sending out a signal to a ship he had stashed away years ago, hidden in the asteroid belt just beyond the moon's orbit. The ship responded almost immediately, its engines powering up as it began its journey toward the prison. Arden felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wouldn't be long now. As he waited, he glanced at the surveillance monitors, watching the other prisoners go about their lives, oblivious to the fact that one of their own was about to disappear. He thought about saying goodbye to Lyra, but he knew she wouldn't want that. They had fought together, survived together, but their paths had always been separate. The ship arrived without fanfare, docking at one of the remote hangars on the far side of the prison. Arden slipped through the corridors unnoticed, his footsteps silent as he made his way to the hangar bay. When he finally stepped aboard the ship, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was freedom. Not the kind he had imagined all those years ago when he was running jobs across the system, but something deeper, something more real. As the ship lifted off, leaving the prison and the dying star behind, Arden set a course for the outer rim of the galaxy. That was where the Reapers had come from. That was where they waited. And Arden was coming for them.